The night sky over Dubai glittered like a jeweled tapestry, the skyscrapers piercing through the darkness with their neon halos. Among the city's architectural marvels stood the Al Saif Tower, a monolith of glass and steel that exuded both opulence and menace. Ethan Kane adjusted the earpiece in his left ear as he scanned the shimmering facade from the alley below. The voices of the city, car horns, distant laughter, the murmur of a nearby fountain, seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythmic thrum of his heartbeat. This was it. "Kane, you're in position," came the voice of his handler, Marcus DeWitt, calm and clipped. Marcus had always been the steady hand guiding Ethan's volatile instincts, though he knew when to step back and let Ethan's raw skill take over. "Copy that," Ethan whispered, his voice a low rasp as he fastened the harness to the grappling hook. He gave it a firm tug, ensuring it held secure to the edge of the 40th floor, the penthouse level. A deep breath steadied his nerves, and he began his ascent, his gloved hands moving deftly over the rope as his body glided upward. The city below shrank with every meter he climbed, the lights of passing cars reduced to streaks of gold and red. When he reached the 40th floor, he swung himself onto a narrow ledge and pressed his back against the glass. He could feel the faint hum of the building's air conditioning units vibrating through the pane. Inside, shadows danced against the walls, security guards patrolling, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Timing would be everything. He pulled out a compact device from his belt, a signal jammer, and pressed a button. The red light blinked, indicating the building's surveillance cameras were temporarily offline. He retrieved a glass cutter and began etching a precise circle into the pane, the blade's faint screech lost to the city's distant hum. Slipping inside, Ethan crouched low, his movements cat-like as he surveyed the room. The penthouse exuded wealth. Marble floors, abstract art pieces on the walls, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. But it wasn't the decor that held his attention. His target, a jittery man in his late 40s named Khalid Al-Amin, sat at a desk in the corner, typing feverishly on a laptop. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes darted to the door every few seconds. "Al-Amin," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "We don't have much time." Khalid startled, his chair spinning as he turned to face Ethan. "You're late," he hissed, his voice tinged with both relief and panic. "They know I'm here. They're coming for me? Then we'd better move." Ethan crossed the room in 2 quick strides and yanked the laptop's power cable. "Did you get the intel?" Khalid nodded frantically, holding up a flash drive. "Everything you need, but it's bigger than you think. Rostov, he's after the Shard." Ethan's brow furrowed. "The Shard?" Before Khalid could elaborate, the sound of boots echoed down the hallway. Ethan froze, his instincts screaming at him to act. He grabbed Khalid by the arm. "We're leaving. Now!" The door burst open, splinters flying as 3 armed men stormed in, their faces obscured by tactical masks. Ethan reacted instantly, shoving Khalid behind the desk as he drew his silenced pistol. 2 precise shots dropped the first 2 intruders, but the third fired back, the bullets whizzing past Ethan's head. "Stay down!" Ethan barked at Khalid, vaulting over the desk and disarming the attacker with a swift kick to the wrist. The man lunged at Ethan, and the 2 grappled, knocking over a glass sculpture that shattered across the floor. Ethan finally overpowered him, slamming the man's head against the desk. He didn't get back up. Ethan's earpiece crackled to life. "Kane, what's going on up there?" Marcus's voice was sharp with concern. "We're compromised," Ethan replied, his breath ragged. "Extraction point?" "Rooftop. 2 minutes." Ethan hauled Khalid to his feet. "Move." They burst into the hallway, the sound of more footsteps closing in. Ethan fired a few suppressing shots, his mind racing. The elevator was out of the question. The stairwell would be a death trap. That left one option. The two emerged onto the rooftop, the cool night air a stark contrast to the tension radiating between them. A helicopter loomed in the distance, its blades slicing through the air as it approached. "Stay close," Ethan ordered, scanning the perimeter. But before they could reach the edge, more mercenaries emerged from a rooftop access door, their rifles trained on Ethan and Khalid. "Drop the gun, Kane," one of them growled, his accent thick and unplaceable. Ethan raised his hand slowly, his mind working furiously. "You're making a mistake," he said, stalling. "Rostov doesn't forgive failure." The man hesitated, just enough for Ethan to act. In one fluid motion, he drew a concealed knife from his boot and hurled it, the blade embedding itself in the mercenary's throat. Chaos erupted as Ethan grabbed Khalid and sprinted for the helicopter, bullets sparking against the rooftop behind them. They reached the edge just as the helicopter hovered into position. Ethan shoved Khalid inside before grabbing the skid and pulling himself up. "Go," he shouted to the pilot, who didn't need to be told twice. As they ascended, the rooftop exploded below them, a fiery blast that sent shockwaves through the air. Ethan shielded Khalid as debris rained down, his jaw set in grim determination. When the helicopter finally leveled out, Ethan turned to Khalid, who was clutching the flash drive like a lifeline. "What's on it?" Ethan demanded. Khalid's eyes met his, wide with terror. "The shard, it's real. Rostov has it." Ethan leaned back, the weight of those words settling over him like a storm cloud. He didn't know what the shard was, but he knew one thing. If Rostov wanted it, the world was in danger. "Marcus," Ethan said into his earpiece, his voice cold and resolute. "We got a problem." The city of Istanbul stretched before Ethan Kane like an intricate mosaic of time. Ancient minarets and domed mosques nestled between sleek skyscrapers and bustling bazaars. The evening call to prayer echoed faintly through the streets, mingling with the hum of life below. Ethan stood on the balcony of his safe house, his silhouette blending into the twilight. The safe house was tucked away in one of Istanbul's older quarters, a modest apartment hidden behind a nondescript facade. Inside, the space was Spartan. A small kitchen, a threadbare sofa, a desk cluttered with encrypted devices, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. The flash drive Khalid had died to protect sat on the desk, its unassuming appearance belying the chaos it had unleashed. Ethan's fingers brushed against it as he leaned over, his jaw tightening. His thoughts drifted to Khalid's final words, "The shard, it's real." And Viktor Rostov had it. The name alone sent a ripple of unease through him. Ethan's phone buzzed, jolting him back to the present. He glanced at the encrypted screen. A single message flashed. "Meet me. Usual place. Torres. Isabel Torres." The name brought a surge of conflicting emotions. A brilliant cryptologist and former colleague, she had been one of the few people Ethan had trusted during his time with the CIA. She had a knack for uncovering secrets and keeping them. But it had been years since they'd spoken, not since. Ethan pushed the memory away and focused on the message. The usual place was a cafe by the Bosphorus, where they had once exchanged intel under the guise of casual diners. The choice of location was deliberate, public, open, and difficult to surveil. He typed a quick reply, "On my way." Ethan arrived at the cafe just as dusk gave way to night, the lights of Istanbul reflecting on the water. The cafe was a quaint riverside spot with wooden tables and string lights swaying gently in the breeze. He spotted Isabel immediately. She sat at a table near the edge, her dark hair swept back into a loose bun. She wore a leather jacket over a simple blouse, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. But her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Therese," Ethan greeted as he approached, sliding into the seat opposite her. "Kane," she replied, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. You look older, and you look exactly the same, Ethan countered, his tone neutral, but his eyes scanning her for any signs of deception. Old habits died hard. Isabel's smirk faded as she leaned forward. I wouldn't have called if it wasn't important. Ethan nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Rostov, she said, lowering her voice. He's back in play, and whatever he's after this time, it's dangerous. Ethan's jaw tightened. He's tied to my last mission. The one that, he stopped, his voice catching. What do you know about the shard? Isabel's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. The Veil Shard? I've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. Supposedly, it's a relic, something ancient, powerful. But it's always been dismissed as myth. It's not a myth, Ethan said grimly. Kala died to tell me Rostov has it. Isabel's expression hardened. If Rostov has the shard, we're in trouble. The kind of trouble that doesn't end quietly. Why now? Ethan pressed. What's his endgame? Isabel hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. This might help. Ethan opened it to find surveillance photos, financial records, and coded transmissions. One photo caught his eye, a shipment being loaded onto a cargo plane. The manifest listed it as archaeological artifacts. Where was this taken? Ethan asked. A private airstrip in Belarus, Isabel said. Rostov's people have been moving assets out of there for weeks. Whatever he's planning, it's big. Ethan's mind raced. Belarus wasn't far from where his team had been ambushed all those years ago. The mission that had cost him everything. You need to let this go, Isabel said, breaking into his thoughts. Her voice was soft but firm. I know what happened to your team, but chasing Rostov nearly killed you last time. Don't let it finish the job. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers. If Rostov has the shard, I can't walk away. You know that. Isabel sighed, leaning back. Then I hope you're ready for what's coming. Because if the shard is as powerful as the legends say, we're all in over our heads. Back at the safe house, Ethan sat at his desk, the folder spread before him. The flash drive remained untouched, a Pandora's box he wasn't ready to open. His mind replayed Isabel's words, mingling with memories of his fallen team. He pulled a photograph from his drawer, a faded snapshot of his team, taken days before the ambush. Their faces smiled back at him, full of life and camaraderie. His chest tightened with guilt and resolve. The encrypted laptop beeped, signaling an incoming transmission. Ethan opened it cautiously. The message was brief, Belarus. Coordinates attached. Come alone. Ethan's gaze hardened as he memorized the coordinates. He knew it was a trap, but if Rostov was there, he had no choice. He packed his gear, double-checking his weapons and the flash drive. As he stepped onto the balcony, the city sprawled below him like a living entity. The stakes had never been higher, and this time he would finish what had started years ago, no matter the cost. The hunt for Viktor Rostov had begun. The air in the Grand Bazaar was thick with a mingling sense of spices, leather, and the faint metallic tang of copper. Ethan Kane weaved through the labyrinthine alleys, his senses on high alert. The market was a living entity, pulsing with the shouts of vendors hawking their wares and the laughter of tourists haggling over trinkets. He moved with purpose, his hand brushing the hidden holster beneath his jacket. Istanbul was a city of many faces, and today it wore the guise of intrigue. Ethan's eyes scanned the crowd, seeking the familiar face of Isabel Torres. She had chosen the bazaar for their meeting, citing its crowded and chaotic nature as an effective cover. Isabel was a master of blending in, her brilliance as a cryptologist matched only by her knack for vanishing when the situation demanded it. Ethan's jaw tightened as he replayed her cryptic message in his mind. Asterisk, the shard is real. I have proof. Meet me at the bazaar at noon. The clock on his wrist ticked 12:03 as he approached a stall laden with silk scarves in vibrant hues. A woman in a simple headscarf and sunglasses stood there, examining a deep blue fabric. Her movements were deliberate but unhurried, a stark contrast to the bustling energy around her. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. "Nice choice," he said, his tone casual. "Blue suits you." Isabel's lips twitched in a faint smile. Without looking up, she replied, "It's not for me." "But you're late, Ethan." "Traffic," he quipped, stepping beside her. "Let's move." They walked in silence, their path winding deeper into the bazaar. Isabel's hand brushed against his, slipping a small envelope into his palm. Ethan didn't stop to inspect it. Instead, he tucked it into his jacket pocket, his eyes darting to a group of men loitering near a jewelry stall. Their postures were too rigid, their eyes too focused. Ethan's instincts prickled. "You've got company," he murmured. Isabel's face remained impassive. "Rostov's men. They've been shadowing me since Prague. Let's make this quick then. What's in the envelope?" "Satellite imagery and intercepted communications," she said. "It confirms the existence of the Veil Shard and Rostov's obsession with it." Ethan's mind raced. The Veil Shard was the stuff of myths, a fragment of ancient power said to bend reality itself. If Rostov had it, the implications were catastrophic. But before he could probe further, the air around them shifted. A sudden silence fell over the bazaar, unnatural and chilling. Ethan's hand went to his sidearm as a voice rang out. "Ethan Kane. Isabel Torres. Fancy seeing you here." The voice was smooth, laced with mockery. Ethan turned to see Anya Volkova emerging from the shadows of a nearby archway. Her platinum blonde hair caught the sunlight, and her piercing blue eyes locked onto him with predatory intensity. Dressed in a sleek black leather jacket, she exuded lethal elegance. Behind her stood a dozen mercenaries, their weapons hidden, but their intent unmistakable. "Volkova," Ethan said, his tone cold. "Didn't expect you to leave Rostov's side." Her lips curved into a smirk. "He's busy, so I thought I'd handle his errands. Hand over the envelope, and we'll let you leave." Ethan chuckled darkly. "You and I both know that's not how this works." Volkova's smile faded. "Pity." With a sharp gesture, she signaled her men. The bazaar erupted into chaos as the mercenaries drew their weapons, scattering vendors and shoppers. Ethan grabbed Isabel's wrist and pulled her into a sprint, weaving through the panicked crowd. "Stick close," he shouted over the cacophony. Bullets whizzed past them, striking stalls and sending shards of wood and pottery flying. Ethan fired over his shoulder, his shots precise and deliberate, taking down two pursuers. Isabel clutched the strap of her bag, her face pale but determined. "This way," she called, veering down a narrow alley lined with spice vendors. The heady aroma of cumin and saffron filled the air, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Ethan followed, his grip on his weapon tight. The alley opened into a courtyard, its centerpiece a crumbling fountain surrounded by stone benches. Ethan's sharp eyes spotted a service ladder leading to the rooftops. He pointed. "Up there." They scaled the ladder, the metal rungs slick with sweat and grit. From the rooftop, the bazaar sprawled out below them, a maze of vibrant awnings and winding paths. Ethan could see Volkova and her men regrouping, their gazes sweeping upward. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered. Isabel handed him a compact device. "Smoke grenade. It's all I've got." Ethan nodded, pulling the pin and tossing it onto the street below. Thick gray smoke billowed out, obscuring their movements. Using the cover, they sprinted across the rooftops, leaping from one building to the next. The uneven terrain tested their agility, but adrenaline kept them moving. As they reached the edge of the bazaar, A helicopter's distant whir grew louder. Ethan glanced up to see a sleek black chopper approaching, its side emblazoned with an unfamiliar logo. "Friend of yours?" Isabel asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Hardly," Ethan replied. "We need to disappear." They descended into another alley, this one quieter and less chaotic. Ethan led Isabel to a hidden doorway, pushing it open to reveal a dimly lit storeroom. They slipped inside, bolting the door behind them. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Ethan turned to Isabel, his expression grim. "What else aren't you telling me?" Isabel hesitated, her eyes darting to the envelope now crumpled in his pocket. "There's a second piece to the shard. Rostov doesn't just have it. He's trying to activate it." Ethan's stomach sank. "Activate it? How?" "I don't know yet," Isabel admitted. "But if he succeeds, it could rewrite reality itself." Ethan's fist clenched. "Then we stop him, no matter what it takes." Outside, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Ethan and Isabel exchanged a glance. The hunt was far from over. The spires of Prague's Gothic skyline loomed under a steel-gray sky, a city caught in time between shadow and history. Rain slicked the cobblestones as Kane moved through the labyrinthine streets, his footsteps silent despite the bustling evening crowd. Beside him, Isabel Torres clutched her coat tightly around her, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They were heading towards St. Vitus Cathedral, an architectural masterpiece now crumbling in neglect, its once majestic facade marred by centuries of decay. "You sure about this lead?" Ethan asked, his voice low as they rounded a corner. "As sure as I am that Rostov isn't far behind us," Isabel replied, her tone clipped but tinged with urgency. She adjusted the strap of the satchel slung across her shoulder. "The broker has connections to the artifact trade. If anyone knows about the map, it'll be him." Ethan nodded but remained silent. The weight of their pursuit and the shadowy figure of Rostov pressed heavily on his mind. He tightened his grip on the small firearm concealed beneath his jacket. Every instinct told him this meeting would not go smoothly. The cathedral emerged from the fog like a spectral guardian, its towering arches and gargoyles carved with grotesque precision. The stained glass windows, now opaque with grime, seemed to glower down at them as they approached the massive wooden doors. Ethan pushed one open with effort, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and old stone. A figure emerged from the shadows near the altar, his silhouette sharp against the dim light filtering through the fractured windows. He was tall and lean, with a sharp nose and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see too much. His tailored suit, though elegant, was frayed at the cuffs, and his hands were adorned with rings of various metals and gemstones. "Mr. Kane, Miss Torres," the man greeted, his voice smooth as silk but carrying an edge of menace. "Welcome to my humble sanctuary." "Gregor Novak," Isabel said, stepping forward but maintaining a cautious distance. "We need information about the map." Novak's lips curled into a thin smile. "Straight to business, I see." "Very well." He gestured to a stone table near the altar, upon which lay a series of old parchment scrolls, maps, and a small glass case containing what appeared to be an ancient relic. The Veil Shard, a fragment of an artifact believed to transcend the boundaries of reality. Legends say it was shattered long ago, its pieces scattered across the globe to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And the map?" Novak's expression darkened. "The map," he said, lifting a fragile-looking scroll, "leads to the final piece of the shard. But be warned, pursuing it will place you on a path fraught with danger. The shard's power is intoxicating. Many have killed for less. Isabel stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the scroll. Where did you get this? Novak's smile returned, but before he could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cathedral. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his gun as the shadows at the far end of the nave shifted. Emerging from the darkness was Anya Volkova, her black leather jacket glinting in the faint light. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and her eyes were like ice, cold and unyielding. I knew you'd come here, Anya said, her voice carrying a mocking lilt. She took a step closer, her hand resting on the hilt of a blade strapped to her thigh. Novak always did have a weakness for desperate souls. Volkova, Ethan said evenly, his voice a mix of irritation and resolve. This doesn't concern you. She laughed, the sound echoing eerily in the cavernous space. Oh, but it does. Rostov wants the shard, and I'm here to make sure you don't get in his way. Novak shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Ethan and Anya. I have no interest in your personal vendettas, he said. Take your conflicts elsewhere. But it was too late. Anya lunged, her blade flashing as she aimed for Ethan. He sidestepped just in time, drawing his gun and firing a shot that grazed her shoulder. She snarled, spinning to deliver a roundhouse kick that sent the weapon flying from his grasp. The fight was brutal and unrelenting, their movements a blur of strikes and counters. Ethan's training was evident in his precision, but Anya matched him blow for blow, her agility and ferocity forcing him to stay on the defensive. Isabel, meanwhile, grabbed the scroll from the table and stuffed it into her satchel. Go! Ethan shouted, blocking another strike from Anya. Isabel hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but Novak grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a side exit. This way, he hissed. Ethan's distraction cost him. Anya landed a punch to his ribs, followed by a knee to his stomach that sent him sprawling. She loomed over him, her blade raised for the killing blow. You should have stayed out of this, she said, her voice cold and final. But Ethan wasn't done. He grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and slashed at her leg, causing her to stumble back with a cry of pain. Seizing the opportunity, he scrambled to his feet and delivered a powerful kick that sent her crashing into a nearby pillar. Ethan didn't wait to see if she'd recover. He sprinted toward the exit Novak and Isabel had taken, his breaths ragged and his body aching. The sound of sirens in the distance warned that their window of escape was closing fast. Outside, the rain had turned into a downpour, washing the cobblestones slick. Ethan spotted Isabel and Novak climbing into a black SUV parked in the shadows. He dove into the back seat just as the engine roared to life. Drive, he barked. The vehicle sped off, the cathedral receding into the rain-soaked night. Ethan leaned back, wincing as he pressed a hand to his bruised ribs. Isabel handed him the satchel, her expression a mixture of relief and guilt. I got the map, she said quietly. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. Good, but this isn't over. From the front seat, Novak glanced at them through the rearview mirror, his eyes glittering with a mix of intrigue and unease. You've made powerful enemies tonight, he said. I hope you're ready for what's coming. Ethan stared out the window, the rain blurring the lights of the city as they sped through the darkened streets. He didn't reply. His mind was already racing ahead, plotting their next move, and bracing for the storm that was sure to follow. The icy winds of Siberia howled through the dense pine forest, biting at Ethan Kane's face like 1,000 needles. He adjusted his snow goggles and glanced at Isabel Torres, who was crouched beside him behind a rocky outcrop. Her breath came out in short, visible puffs, her dark eyes locked on the fortified bunker nestled in the valley below. The facility was a stark contrast to the pristine wilderness surrounding it. Its steel walls gleamed under the pale moonlight, a fortress of cold efficiency with watchtowers rising like sentinels. Floodlights swept across the perimeter, their beams cutting through the swirling snow. Armed guards patrolled with the precision of clockwork, and a faint hum emanated from the electrified fence encircling the compound. "That's the place," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. Isabel nodded, her voice tense. "And Rostov's inside. Let's hope this Dr. Ivanov is worth the risk." Ethan's jaw tightened. If Ivanov's telling the truth about what they're doing in there, we can't afford not to take the risk. He checked his gear one last time, ensuring his silenced pistol, grappling hook, and EMP device were secure. "Ready? Ready?" Isabel's voice was steady, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as she glanced at the bunker. Together, they moved like shadows, slipping through the snow-draped terrain toward the facility. Ethan led the way, his movements practiced and deliberate. He avoided the floodlights with precision, signaling Isabel when to follow. Her footsteps were almost silent, a testament to the training she'd received since joining Ethan on this dangerous mission. The outer fence was their first obstacle. Ethan knelt beside the control box, its surface already frosted over. He retrieved a compact EMP device from his backpack and attached it to the panel. A low hum resonated as the device activated, sending a pulse that temporarily disabled the electrical current. "Go," Ethan whispered. Isabel slipped through first, her lithe frame moving effortlessly between the wires. Ethan followed, pausing briefly to remove the EMP device and reactivate the current. They couldn't risk leaving a trail. The facility loomed closer now, its walls smooth and featureless save for a single entrance guarded by 2 sentries. Ethan scanned the area, spotting a maintenance hatch partially obscured by a snowdrift. He pointed toward it, and Isabel nodded in understanding. Inside the bunker, the temperature rose sharply, the sterile, high-tech interior a stark contrast to the frozen wilderness outside. Ethan's earpiece crackled to life. Surveillance grid is online. Marcus DeWitt's voice came through, calm and reassuring. He was monitoring their progress from a safe house miles away. "You've got a patrol coming down the east corridor. Ethan, 30 seconds. Copy that," Ethan replied, motioning for Isabel to take cover behind a stack of metal crates. They waited in tense silence as the guard's boots echoed through the hallway. Ethan held his breath, his hand hovering over his pistol. When the footsteps faded, he gave Isabel the signal to move. The deeper they ventured, the more sinister the facility became. They passed rows of reinforced doors, each one labeled with cryptic codes. Occasionally, muffled voices or the hum of machinery could be heard from within. Isabel paused at one door, her expression darkening as she glanced through a small observation window. Inside, a man lay strapped to a metal table, wires protruding from his temples. Monitors displayed erratic brainwave patterns, and a faint, otherworldly glow emanated from a crystalline fragment suspended above him. "Is that?" Isabel began, her voice trembling. "Part of the shard," Ethan confirmed grimly. He pulled her away. "We'll come back for them. First, we find Ivanov." Dr. Ivanov's lab was a labyrinth of advanced technology and chaos. Tables were strewn with papers, vials of unknown substances, and holographic displays showing complex equations. In the center of the room stood a middle-aged man with disheveled hair and a lab coat smeared with ink and blood. He froze when Ethan and Isabel entered, his eyes wide with fear. "Dr. Ivanov," Ethan said, lowering his weapon slightly. "We're here to get you out." Ivanov shook his head, his hands trembling. "You shouldn't have come. He'll kill you. He'll kill us all." "Rostov," Isabel pressed. "What is he planning?" Ivanov hesitated, then glanced at a nearby console. "He has the fragment. He's using it to experiment on human subjects, trying to unlock its full potential. If he succeeds, he'll be able to bend reality itself. Time, space, even life and death. Nothing will be beyond his control. Ethan's stomach churned. What about the rest of the shard? He's close to finding it, Ivanov admitted. If he gets the complete artifact, he'll... His voice broke, and he took a shuddering breath. You have to stop him. Before Ethan could respond, the door burst open, and a squad of armed mercenaries flooded into the lab. Leading them was Anya Volkova, her piercing blue eyes locking onto Ethan with predatory focus. Kane, she said, her voice a mixture of amusement and menace. I've been waiting for this. The lab erupted into chaos. Ethan pushed Ivanov behind a console as bullets tore through the air. Isabel returned fire, her aim precise despite the odds. Ethan engaged Anya directly, their clash a brutal dance of skill and aggression. She moved with lethal grace, her strikes precise and relentless. Still chasing ghosts, Kane, she taunted, dodging a swing and countering with a kick that sent him sprawling. You can't win. Ethan gritted his teeth, grabbing a metal rod from a nearby table to block her next attack. We'll see about that. The fight took them across the lab, shattering equipment and scattering papers. Isabel managed to disable most of the mercenaries, but reinforcements were already on their way. Ethan knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Ivanov, Ethan shouted. Where's the map? The scientist fumbled with a drawer, pulling out a small, intricately designed device. Here, take it. Ethan snatched the device just as Anya lunged at him again. This time, he was ready. Using her momentum against her, he threw her into a console, sparks flying as it short-circuited. Isabel, we're leaving. She nodded, covering their retreat as Ethan hauled Ivanov toward the exit. Anya rose to her feet, her expression murderous, but before she could pursue, Ethan activated a smoke grenade, filling the room with a thick, choking cloud. The trio emerged into the frigid Siberian night, their breaths ragged. A snowmobile was waiting where they'd hidden it earlier, and Ethan wasted no time getting Ivanov and Isabel on board. As they sped away, the facility behind them erupted in alarms. Ethan glanced back, his mind racing. They had the map, but the cost of failure had never been higher. Rostov's plans were more dangerous than he'd imagined, and time was running out. What now? Isabel asked, her voice steady despite the chaos they'd just escaped. Ethan tightened his grip on the snowmobile's handlebars. We stop him. Whatever it takes. The dim light of a single, flickering bulb cast jagged shadows across the peeling walls of the safe house in Vienna. The place reeked of mildew and regret, a ghost of its former purpose. Ethan Kane stood near the cracked window, his eyes scanning the alley below. He adjusted the grip on his sidearm, the cold steel a reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Behind him, Isabel Torres paced, her fingers twitching as she fought to suppress her anxiety. The ancient veil, shard map, lay on the rickety table between them, a puzzle with pieces still missing. Opposite her, Dr. Ivanov sat in a chair, his hands folded on the table, too calm for someone who had been a prisoner mere hours ago. We don't have much time, Ethan said without turning. His voice was as sharp as the tension hanging in the air. Rostov's men will figure out we're here. Isabel glanced at Ivanov, her brow furrowing. If he's telling the truth, then Rostov already knows more about the shard than we do. We need to move. Ivanov smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. Patience, Miss Torres. The answers you seek cannot be rushed. Ethan turned, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the scientist. We didn't risk everything to save you, just so you could play coy. Start talking. Ivanov's smile faded. He leaned back, the chair creaking ominously. The shard, it is not simply an artifact. It is power incarnate, a key to rewriting reality itself. Rostov seeks not just control, but the sudden metallic clang of a door slamming somewhere in the distance cut him off. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his weapon. "Stay here," he ordered, motioning for Isabel to follow as he moved toward the hallway. "Ethan, wait," Isabel began, but he was already gone, his footsteps silent as a predator's. The hallway was a narrow corridor of faded wallpaper and creaking floorboards. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his senses heightened. He could hear the faint shuffle of boots below, too heavy to be the wind or a stray animal. Someone had found them. He motioned for Isabel to stay behind him, her face pale but resolute. She nodded, gripping the small pistol he had given her earlier. As they approached the stairwell, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement. Two figures in black tactical gear ascended the steps, their rifles sweeping the area. Ethan acted without hesitation. He lunged, grabbing the first man's rifle and twisting it out of his hands before delivering a swift elbow to his temple. The second raised his weapon, but Isabel fired, her shot catching him in the shoulder. The man crumpled with a grunt. "Clear," Ethan said, his voice low. He turned to Isabel, nodding in approval. "Good shot?" "Thanks," she muttered, her hands trembling slightly as she lowered the gun. "But this isn't over, is it? Not even close." Back in the safe house, they found Ivanov standing by the table, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Impressive work," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "But perhaps next time, you might consider securing the perimeter more thoroughly." Ethan ignored the jab, stepping closer until he loomed over the scientist. "Who else knows we're here?" Ivanov's eyes glinted with something Ethan couldn't quite place. "That depends on how well you've been paying attention." The realization hit Ethan a second too late. He felt the sharp sting of a syringe plunging into his neck. His vision blurred as his knees buckled. Isabel's scream echoed in his ears, distant and distorted as darkness claimed him. When Ethan came to, the world swam into focus in shades of gray and pain. He was bound to a chair, the coarse ropes digging into his wrists. Ivanov stood before him, a pistol in hand and an expression of cold triumph on his face. "You betrayed us," Ethan managed, his voice slurred but laced with venom. Ivanov chuckled. "Betrayal implies loyalty to begin with. You were always just a means to an end, Mr. Kane." Isabel was on her knees nearby, her hands tied behind her back. Her face was bruised, but her eyes burned with defiance. "Why, Ivanov? After everything, why side with Rostov?" "Because Rostov understands the true potential of the Shard," Ivanov said, pacing as he spoke. "He has the vision to reshape the world. And I intend to be at his side when he does." Ethan's mind raced. He needed to act, but the drug Ivanov had used was still dulling his reflexes. He glanced at Isabel, catching her eye. She gave a subtle nod, a signal that she was ready for whatever came next. "You're making a mistake," Ethan said, stalling. "Rostov doesn't share power. You're expendable to him." Ivanov's smile faltered, just for a moment. It was all the opening Ethan needed. He wrenched his arm against the ropes, the pain sharp but satisfying as the fibers began to give. At the same time, Isabel lunged, slamming her shoulder into Ivanov's side. The gun fired, the bullet shattering a nearby window. Ethan broke free, tackling Ivanov to the ground. The two men struggled, trading blows in a brutal, desperate fight. Ivanov managed to grab a shard of glass from the broken window, slashing at Ethan's arm. Blood flowed, but Ethan ignored the pain, landing a punch that left Ivanov dazed. "This ends now," Ethan growled, grabbing the pistol from the floor. He aimed it at Ivanov, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Ethan, wait," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "We need him alive." He knows too much. Ethan hesitated, his chest heaving. But Ivanov's hand moved toward his pocket, and Ethan knew he couldn't take the risk. He fired, the shot echoing in the small room. Ivanov's body went limp, his eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel stood, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "You didn't have to kill him. He didn't give me a choice," Ethan replied, his voice hollow. He turned away, wiping the blood from his arm. "Let's go. We still have a mission." But as they left the safe house, the weight of Ivanov's betrayal and the cost of their choices hung heavy between them. Isabel's doubt was evident in her eyes, and for the first time, Ethan wondered if he was truly fighting for the right reasons, or if this was all just a vendetta disguised as a mission to save the world. The dense canopy of the Amazon jungle swallowed the sunlight, casting the forest floor into a perpetual state of twilight. Towering trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches intertwined like the fingers of ancient gods. The air was thick with humidity, a suffocating blanket that clung to Ethan Kane and Isabel Torres as they hacked their way through the undergrowth. Each step was accompanied by the cacophony of the jungle, screeching birds, buzzing insects, and the distant growl of some unseen predator. Ethan paused, leaning on his machete, and glanced back at Isabel. Her face was streaked with sweat and dirt, but her eyes burned with determination. In her hands, she clutched the map they had risked everything to acquire, its edges worn and stained from their journey. "How much farther?" Ethan asked, his voice low but tense. Isabel unfolded the map, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "The temple should be just beyond that ridge," she said, pointing ahead to where the land sloped upward into a tangle of vines and moss-covered boulders. "If Rostov's here, this is where he'll make his move." Ethan nodded and adjusted the strap of his rifle. "Let's hope we're not too late." As they pushed forward, the jungle seemed to come alive around them. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the air grew heavier with each step. Isabel shivered despite the heat. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Ethan stopped and scanned their surroundings, his instincts on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Yeah, it's like the air's charged." A sudden rustling in the foliage made them both spin, weapons raised. A flock of birds erupted from the trees, their cries echoing through the jungle. Ethan exhaled slowly, his finger easing off the trigger. "Let's keep moving." The ridge gave way to a clearing, and there it stood, the temple. An imposing structure of weathered stone and intricate carvings. It rose from the jungle like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Vines and moss clung to its surface, but the symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, as if imbued with some ancient power. "The shard's energy," Isabel murmured, her voice tinged with awe and fear. "It's real." Ethan scanned the area, his sharp eyes catching movement near the temple's entrance. Rostov's mercenaries, clad in tactical gear, patrolled the perimeter. There were at least a dozen of them, heavily armed and alert. "Looks like we've got company," Ethan said, pulling Isabel down behind a fallen log for cover. "We'll need to be smart about this." Isabel's brow furrowed as she studied the mercenaries. "They're not just guarding the temple. They're preparing for something. Look at their equipment." Ethan followed her gaze and saw what she meant. Crates of explosives, advanced scanning devices, and strange, arcane symbols painted on their gear. Whatever Rostov was planning, it was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Using the jungle as cover, Ethan and Isabel crept closer to the temple. The mercenaries moved in disciplined patterns, but Ethan's years of experience allowed him to predict their movements. With silent precision, he took down 2 guards with his knife, their bodies slumping into the shadows. Isabel worked quickly to disable a perimeter alarm, her nimble fingers moving over the device with practiced ease. "That should give us a window," she whispered. "Good. Let's move." They slipped inside the temple, the air growing colder as they descended into its depths. The walls were lined with carvings depicting scenes of worship and chaos, the figures twisted and otherworldly. A faint hum filled the air, resonating in their bones. "This place is alive," Isabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shard's power is overwhelming." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Stay focused. We got a job to do." In the central chamber, they found Rostov. The shadowy figure stood before an ornate altar, his back to them. In his hands, he held a fragment of the veil shard, its surface pulsating with an eerie light. Around him, his remaining mercenaries formed a protective circle, their weapons trained on the chamber's entrances. "You're too late, Kane," Rostov said without turning, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. "The shard's power is mine. Not if I have anything to say about it," Ethan replied, stepping into the light. His rifle was trained on Rostov, but the mercenaries immediately raised their weapons in response. Rostov turned, a smug smile on his face. "You don't understand, do you? The shard isn't just an artifact. It's a key to reshaping reality." Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon. "And you think you can control that kind of power?" Rostov chuckled. "Control? No, Kane. I'm going to unleash it." Before Ethan could respond, the chamber shook violently. The shard's light intensified, and the air around it seemed to ripple. The mercenaries exchanged nervous glances, but Rostov remained unfazed. "Kill them," he ordered, and chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the air as Ethan and Isabel dove for cover. Ethan returned fire, his shots precise and lethal, while Isabel worked to disrupt the energy field surrounding the shard. The mercenaries advanced, their movements coordinated and relentless. Ethan engaged one in close combat, their fight brutal and unrelenting. He disarmed the man with a well-placed strike and used his own weapon to take out another. Blood and sweat mingled as the battle raged on. Meanwhile, Isabel's hands flew over a control panel near the altar, her mind racing to decipher the ancient symbols. "I need more time," she shouted. "We don't have it." Ethan called back, taking down another mercenary. Just as it seemed they were outnumbered, the chamber's carvings began to glow, and ethereal figures emerged from the walls. Guardians of the shard, their forms shimmering and otherworldly, descended upon the combatants, attacking indiscriminately. "What the hell is this?" Ethan shouted, narrowly avoiding a swipe from one of the spectral beings. "The shard's protectors," Isabel replied, her voice tinged with both awe and fear. "They're defending it from everyone." The room became a whirlwind of chaos as mercenaries, guardians, and Ethan fought for survival. Rostov, undeterred, continued his ritual, the shard's power engulfing him. "Ethan," Isabel cried, "if he completes the ritual, it's over." Ethan made a split-second decision. He charged toward Rostov, dodging bullets and spectral attacks alike. With a primal roar, he tackled the man, sending the shard tumbling from his grasp. The artifact's light flared, blinding everyone in the chamber. When the light subsided, the guardians vanished, and the chamber fell silent. Rostov lay unconscious, and the shard pulsed weakly on the ground. Ethan picked it up, its surface warm and humming with residual energy. He looked at Isabel, who nodded grimly. "We need to destroy it." Ethan glanced back at Rostov, then at the shard. "Let's finish this." The temple's chamber pulsed with an otherworldly light, a kaleidoscope of swirling energy radiating from the veil shard perched atop an ancient obsidian altar. The jagged artifact, glowing with a sickly green hue, seemed to thrum with a heartbeat of its own, sending ripples of distorted air through the room. The walls, carved with intricate glyphs depicting gods and monsters, shimmered as if alive, their stories shifting and rewriting themselves in real time. The air was dense, heavy with an unnatural charge that made every breath a struggle. Ethan Kane crouched behind a shattered column, sweat dripping down his face as he tried to steady his racing heart. Beside him, Isabel Torres clutched a compact firearm, her knuckles white as she whispered, "This place feels wrong." "That's because it is," Ethan muttered, peeking out to survey the room. Victor Rostov stood at the center of the chamber, his imposing figure framed by the flickering energy emanating from the shard. Clad in black tactical gear, he looked more like a warlord than the enigmatic manipulator he was. His voice carried over the hum of the ritual, commanding and resonant, chanting words in an ancient tongue that seemed to claw at the edges of sanity. Around Rostov, a circle of mercenaries stood guard, their weapons trained on the entrances. They were tense, their gazes flickering nervously to the swirling vortex of energy above the altar. Whatever Rostov was unleashing, it was clear even his men were unsure if they wanted to witness it. "We need to move now," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "If he completes that ritual, there's no telling what will happen. And by what, you mean end of the world, right?" Isabel quipped, her voice tinged with nervous sarcasm. Despite the fear in her eyes, there was a spark of determination that reminded Ethan why he trusted her. Ethan nodded grimly. "Something like that." They moved as one, creeping along the shadows cast by the flickering light of the shard. Ethan's mind raced, formulating a plan. Disrupting the ritual meant getting to Rostov, but the mercenaries and the unpredictable energy of the shard made it a near impossible task. As they approached the edge of the chamber, a sudden surge of light erupted from the shard, accompanied by a deafening crack. The energy lashed out, striking a nearby column and reducing it to rubble. Ethan and Isabel ducked instinctively as shards of stone rained down around them. "The shard is destabilizing," Isabel whispered. "He's pushing it too far." "Good," Ethan said. "Maybe we can use that." He signaled for Isabel to cover him, then sprinted toward the nearest mercenary. The man turned too late, his eyes widening in shock as Ethan's fist connected with his jaw, dropping him instantly. Ethan grabbed the fallen man's rifle, spinning to fire a burst at another guard before he could react. Chaos erupted as the remaining mercenaries opened fire, their bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. "Ethan!" Isabel shouted, diving for cover as another energy surge crackled through the air, narrowly missing her. The shard's glow intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced like specters across the chamber. Ethan pressed forward, weaving through the hail of gunfire. He reached the edge of the altar, locking eyes with Rostov. "Kane," Rostov said, his lips curling into a cold smile. "You're too late. The shard's power is beyond your comprehension." Ethan leveled his rifle at Rostov. "Maybe, but I don't need to understand it to stop you." Rostov laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. He raised his hand, and the shard responded, a tendril of energy lashing out and striking Ethan's weapon, sending it flying from his hands. Ethan stumbled back, the force of the blast knocking the wind out of him. "You can't stop this," Rostov said, stepping closer. "The shard will remake the world, bend it to my will. And you? You'll be nothing more than a footnote in history." Ethan lunged at Rostov, the two men colliding in a brutal clash of fists and fury. Rostov was strong, his movements calculated, but Ethan fought with a desperation born of knowing the stakes. The two traded blows, their fight a brutal ballet that moved across the chamber, shattering artifacts and toppling columns. Meanwhile, Isabel worked her way to the altar, her eyes locked on the shard. The energy radiating from it made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to focus. She reached in her bag, pulling out a small EMP device she'd rigged during their trek through the jungle. "Ethan," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I need time." Ethan gritted his teeth, blocking a punch from Rostov before countering with a knee to the man's stomach. "You've got it." Rostov recovered quickly, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can destroy this power? You're a fool." Ethan dodged another strike, using Rostov's momentum to throw him into a crumbling pillar. "Maybe," he said, breathing heavily, "but I'd rather die trying than let you win." Isabel activated the EMP device, the machine emitting a high-pitched whine as it charged. The shard seemed to sense the threat, its energy lashing out violently. Isabel ducked as a bolt of green light struck the altar, cracking it down the middle. Just as the EMP reached full charge, a gunshot rang out. Isabel cried out, clutching her shoulder as blood seeped through her fingers. One of the mercenaries had survived, his pistol trained on her. Ethan's heart froze. "Isabel." In that moment of distraction, Rostov tackled Ethan, pinning him to the ground. The two grappled, their struggle taking them dangerously close to the shard. Ethan caught a glimpse of Isabel, her face pale but determined as she reached for the EMP device. With a final burst of strength, Ethan broke free from Rostov's grip, grabbing a shard of broken stone and driving it into the man's shoulder. Rostov screamed, staggering back. "Do it!" Ethan shouted to Isabel. She slammed her hand onto the EMP's trigger. The device emitted a blinding flash of light, followed by a deafening pulse. The shard exploded in a cascade of green energy, the force of the blast throwing everyone in the chamber to the ground. When the dust settled, Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing. The shard was gone, its energy dissipated. Rostov lay unconscious near the shattered altar, blood pooling beneath him. Ethan stumbled to Isabel, who was slumped against a column, clutching her wounded shoulder. "Isabel," he said, his voice hoarse. "You okay?" She managed a weak smile. "I've been better." Before Ethan could respond, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "Nice work, Kane." Ethan turned to see Marcus DeWitt stepping into the chamber, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "You always did know how to make an entrance," Marcus said, his tone dry. Ethan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're late." Marcus shrugged. "Traffic." Together, they helped Isabel to her feet. Ethan glanced back at the ruins of the altar, a sense of unease settling over him. The shard was destroyed, but the vision he'd experienced during the blast lingered in his mind, a glimpse of a future he couldn't yet comprehend. "It's over," Marcus said, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the chamber. For now. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and lavender as waves lapped gently against the shoreline. The beach was a picture of serenity, its sands untouched except for the two figures sitting near the water's edge. Ethan Kane sat with his arms resting on his knees. His usually sharp gaze softened as he watched the tide roll in and out. Beside him, Isabel Torres traced idle patterns in the sand with her fingers, her expression contemplative. "It's hard to believe it's over," Isabel said, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic sound of the waves. Ethan let out a dry chuckle, though there was little humor in it. "Is it ever really over?" She turned to him, studying his profile in the fading light. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, etched by the weight of everything they had endured. "We stopped Rostov. The shard is gone. That has to count for something." "It does," Ethan said, his voice heavy. "But the things I've done, The people I've lost, those don't just disappear. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the sound of the ocean. Isabel finally broke it. You don't have to keep running, you know. You could come back with me. Join my team. Ethan glanced at her, a small, almost wistful smile playing on his lips. You don't give up, do you? Not when I see potential, she replied, her tone earnest. You're good at what you do, Ethan. More than good. And you care, even if you don't want to admit it. We could use someone like you. He looked back out at the horizon, the sun now half submerged in the water. I appreciate the offer, Isabel. I really do. But I've been a part of organizations before. Governments, agencies, teams. It always ends the same way. Betrayal, loss, blood on my hands. I think it's time I tried something different. Isabel's shoulders sagged slightly, but she nodded. I understand. Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. Do you? She met his gaze steadily. More than you think. They sat in silence again, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Ethan stood, brushing the sand from his hands. Take care of yourself, Isabel, and keep fighting the good fight. She stood as well, looking up at him. You too, Ethan. Wherever you end up. He gave her a nod, then turned and began walking down the beach, his figure gradually blending into the twilight. Isabel watched him go, her heart heavy, but filled with a quiet respect for the man who had carried so much and still stood tall. As Ethan disappeared into the distance, Isabel turned back to the water, the cool breeze tugging at her hair. She didn't notice the faint shimmer in the air near the tree-line, nor the pair of eyes, cold, calculating, and unblinking, watching from the shadows. Farther down the beach, Ethan paused and glanced over his shoulder, a faint unease prickling at the edge of his senses. He saw nothing but the tranquil expanse of the shore and the encroaching night. Shaking off the feeling, he continued walking, the sound of the waves accompanying him into the darkness. Unseen by either of them, the shimmer near the tree-line grew brighter for a moment before vanishing entirely, leaving no trace but a lingering sense of foreboding. Ethan Kane was not done. Not yet.